She was 3 years old, barely old enough to tie her shoes, barely old enough to know her own last name. And then she was gone. No ransom note, no body, no answers. Just a little girl who walked out of one life and disappeared into another. For 34 years, her family lit candles on her birthday and wondered if she was still breathing somewhere in this world. Then a single strand of DNA answered a question that had haunted them for 3 decades. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and hit that bell, because what happens in this case will stay with you long after the video ends. 1987, summer. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer and kids begged to stay inside with the fan blowing straight at their faces. Her name was Casey, a name her mother had picked out months before she was born, whispering it to her belly like a prayer. CASEY Marie Williamson, 3 years old, dark curly hair, eyes that her mother described to every detective, every reporter, every stranger who would listen, as the color of dark honey. She lived in a small rental house on the edge of Lexington, Kentucky, with her mother, Diane, and a rotating cast of people Diane had let into her life during a stretch of years she'd later describe only as my worst time. The morning of August 14th started like most mornings that summer. Casey ate cereal. She watched cartoons. She wore a yellow shirt with a ladybug on the pocket. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she was gone. Diane had stepped inside to answer the phone. She was away from the back door for maybe 4 minutes. She knew because the call was short. She'd checked the clock on the microwave. When she came back out, the yard was empty. Casey's plastic cup was still sitting in the grass, half filled with juice going warm in the sun. Diane screamed her daughter's name until her voice gave out. Neighbors came running. Someone called the police. Within the hour, patrol cars were blocking the end of the street, and officers were fanning out through the surrounding blocks, knocking on doors, checking backyards, peering into drainage ditches with flashlights even though it was still daylight, and every second felt like sand pouring through cupped hands. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a whisper, not a single person who had seen a little girl in a yellow shirt walking anywhere. The initial investigation moved fast. At first, detectives questioned everyone connected to Diane's life. When there were several people of concern, a man named Gary, who had stayed at the house on and off that spring, was brought in twice. He had a record: petty theft, 1 prior domestic charge, and he couldn't fully account for his afternoon. But there was no physical evidence tying him to Casey's disappearance. After 48 hours, he was released. A registered sex offender lived 4 streets over. His house was searched. Again, nothing. The FBI was notified. Posters went up. Casey's face was printed on flyers that Diane carried in a manila folder everywhere she went for the next 30 years. But the case stalled almost as fast as it had started. And here's where it gets maddening. A witness, a teenager who lived 2 doors down, told police she thought she'd seen a woman carrying a young child to a car that afternoon. The woman was older, maybe 50s, heavy-set, driving something dark-colored. The detective who took that statement filed it. And then somehow, it never made it into the main case file. It sat in a box. For years. Casey would have turned 4 that October. Diane baked a cake anyway. She put candles on it. She sang the song alone in her kitchen, crying so hard she could barely get through the words. She did the same thing the following year. And the year after that, the phone calls from detectives slowed, then stopped. The case was technically open. It never officially closed. But the active investigation had quietly wound down by 1989. There were new cases, newer tragedies. The world kept producing missing children faster than anyone could keep up. Diane refused to disappear too. So she became the kind of parent that investigators quietly dread and secretly respect in equal measure. She called the detectives line every few months. She wrote letters to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children every time she read about a new identification technology. She attended candlelight vigils for other missing children, holding her own daughter's photo, standing in the glow with parents who understood exactly how heavy a photograph can feel. Casey's grandmother, a woman named Ruth, papered the inside of her bedroom closet with every news clipping, every update, every printed web page she could find. When Ruth died in 2009, they found that closet. Diane kept every single page. Casey's younger brother, born 2 years after the disappearance, grew up in the shadow of a sister he'd never met. And he printed Casey's age-progressed photo on the back of a business card and carried it in his wallet, just in case. 34 years of just in case. Then came 2021. A genealogy researcher named Pam, a volunteer for a cold case nonprofit operating out of Cincinnati, was working through a backlog of submitted DNA cases when she pulled up one that had been sitting in the queue for over a year. It was Casey's. Diane had submitted a DNA sample in 2019 after reading about the role of genetic genealogy in solving old cases. She hadn't heard anything back. She'd begun to assume it hadn't worked, that Casey's case was too old, too cold, the trail too dead. She was wrong. And Pam uploaded the raw DNA data to one of the public genealogy databases and started building a family tree from partial matches. The painstaking lateral process of tracing third cousins and second cousins once removed until a pattern emerges that points toward a specific family line. It took 4 months. What she found pointed toward a family in rural Tennessee, a family that included a woman in her late 60s who had no record of biological children, but who had raised a daughter who was now 37 years old, a daughter born in roughly the right year, a daughter who had no birth certificate anyone could verify past a certain point. Pam's hands were shaking when she made the call to the detective who had inherited Casey's file. The detective's name was Marcus Webb, 22 years on the force, the last 6 in cold cases. He'd seen DNA break open cases before. He'd learned not to get excited until the lab confirmed what the genealogy suggested, but he drove to Tennessee himself. The woman they were looking for went by the name Leanne. She was living a quiet life, married, 2 kids of her own, working at a veterinary clinic outside of Nashville. She had no idea what was about to happen. When Webb knocked on her door and explained why he was there, Leanne's first reaction was confusion. Then something else crossed her face, something she'd carried without fully naming for a long time. She had always known, in the way that some people know things they can't prove, that something about her origin story didn't add up. The woman who raised her, the woman who had told Leanne she'd been adopted informally, from a struggling mother who couldn't cope, had died in 2015. The story had always had soft edges. Leanne had asked questions over the years and gotten answers that felt rehearsed. She agreed to a DNA test immediately. The results came back in 11 days. CASEY Marie Williamson and Leanne Archer were the same person. Diane got the call on a Tuesday morning. She was standing in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had sung Happy Birthday alone for 34 years, when Detective Webb told her that her daughter was alive. She didn't speak for almost a full minute. Webb later said it was the longest minute of his career. When Diane finally said something, it was just Casey's name, over and over, quietly, like she was testing whether the word still meant what it used to. It did. In the first phone call between Diane and Leanne, Casey lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Neither of them wanted to hang up. Casey's brother sat in the same room as his mother, listening to half a conversation, watching his mother's face do things he had never seen it do before. They met in person 6 weeks later at a neutral location, a hotel conference room, tissues on the table, a social worker quietly present in the corner. Casey walked in first. Diane stood up, and 34 years collapsed into a single moment. The woman who had taken Casey, the woman who had been her mother for 3 decades, had died before the truth came out. Her name was Verna Holcomb. She had no criminal record. Investigators believe she had been unable to have children, and in a period of documented instability, we had taken Casey from that backyard in Lexington and driven across state lines within hours. She had obtained fraudulent paperwork through a network that, by the time investigators started pulling threads in 2021, had long since dissolved. The people involved were either dead or untraceable. There would be no trial, no courtroom, no moment where anyone was forced to answer for what had been stolen. That part, the absence of justice, hit Casey hard. She had spent the first months after her identification swinging between euphoria and a grief she hadn't expected. She had loved Verna. She had called her mom for 34 years. The truth didn't erase that. It just sat beside it permanently. Casey has spoken publicly once, in a short statement released through her attorney. She said she was grateful to be found. And she said she was taking things one day at a time. She said she was learning to hold 2 truths at once, that she was loved by the woman who took her, and that something profound was stolen from her family before she was old enough to understand what family meant. Diane framed that statement and put it on her wall. Gary, the man who had been questioned twice in the original investigation, was cleared entirely. The cold case review confirmed that Verna Holcomb had acted alone, and that teenage witness, the girl who had seen a woman carrying a child to a dark-colored car, she was in her 50s by the time detectives tracked her down. She still remembered it. She had wondered for decades whether what she saw had mattered. It had. The description had matched Verna Holcomb exactly. It had just taken 34 years for anyone to connect it. If this case does anything, if it leaves anything behind, let it be this. DNA doesn't forget. Evidence doesn't expire. And the families who refuse to stop searching are the reason cold cases ever get solved at all. CASEY Williamson spent 34 years living as someone else. She got her name back. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that story. And if you know a cold case that deserves more attention, drop it in the comments. We read every single one. Some doors take decades to open, but they open.